You're with Julian on the Brown Note. Rising house prices have destroyed our way of life. It's certainly true in the two countries I've lived in virtually my whole life, the United Kingdom and Australia. And it's true in a lot of other places where the gold standard of rising house prices has become the dominant factor in life. I've earned more money than my dad my whole life. My dad bought a 3-bedroom home and paid it off. He now lives in a very nice 4-bedroom home. I still cannot afford a 2-bedroom flat in Sydney. I've earned more than him my whole life. I have no home. And he had a home in his 20s in London, in a 2-bedroom home in London, which now very wealthy people cannot afford. He turned what was then a $40,000 investment in his first home in London in today about $1 million home. And he earned less than me his whole life. Since I've been in Sydney for the last 15 years, have turned $500,000 into zero. I have nothing at all to show for it. House prices in Sydney were, in 1981, the equivalent of $250,000 today. I have spent $500,000 in rent and have nothing to show for it. If house prices had been commensurate, and that $250,000 is adjusted for inflation, it was actually $64,000 in 1981. So adjusted for inflation, $250,000 today. I have spent enough in rent to have paid off 2 houses, and I've got nothing. House prices are not $250,000 today. For the average median 3-bedroom home, it is $1.1 million. House prices used to be, in my dad's age, 3.5 times the average wage. Every working class person had a home as their birthright. Now in Sydney, the average house price for a 3-bedroom median home is $1.1 million. It's gone from 3.5 times the average wage to 14 times the average wage. No one can afford that because we worship landlords, just as we did when the democracy came in, when landlords controlled all of the UK in feudal Britain. Landlords owned the land, and then we were given this spectre of owning our own home, and that's why you worked, because you owned your own home. You could pass that on. The ownership of your own home was the only reason to work, because you had something tangible for all of that labour. I don't have anything. I'm told the economy is better. I'm told the economy has gone great. Yet over the last 40 years, for people like me, it has gone backwards. We now spend all of our endeavours, our whole life, paying other people's mortgages. We have no way of passing on that wealth. We've given it to families that already have wealth, who had money to buy a home when it was cheap, that they've now turned into fortunes through no work of their own, but largesse from right-wing governments promoting in this country things like negative gearing, where you get tax breaks on 6 investment properties, franking credits, where you get $10 billion now a year going to people as a gift on tax they haven't paid, and tax breaks for people earning over $180,000 a year, who then spend all that money on property, driving up the cost of rent, driving up the cost of property, so that most people's homes in Sydney make more money a year than they do. And every year it becomes further and further out of our reach. We have now rolled back society to being serfs. People like me are serfs. We are the medieval people that own nothing and simply live at the behest of landlords. It makes me absolutely furious, and we keep voting it in. Society peaked after World War II at some point during the 1970s and into the 80s, and then these neoliberal governments came in and started championing property investors and driving up the price of houses. The places my dad lived and bought his house, and he bought one in East Ham in London. Now that is absolutely wildly out of control beyond the means of virtually anyone. His next was in Chelmsford in Essex. That's now the 10th highest house price in England. He didn't buy them in cheap, crappy areas. He bought them in places that are now extraordinarily expensive. And Sydney is arguably the worst of the bunch. And we keep voting it in. Why won't we do anything to stop this inevitable march? It has destroyed our way of life. We have no way back. How do we correct this? Every time that the housing market should collapse due to its over extravagant house prices, the government finds ways of propping them up by funneling more money to these people. By last year, it could have collapsed when COVID hit, but the government gave billions of dollars to employers and to people on the dole, like I was at the time. I spent all that money on rent. I spent all that money so that somebody else didn't foreclose on their mortgage. And even they got largesse from the government themselves that they never passed on to the public during COVID. 10% of properties got rental relief during COVID. The rest of them said, screw you, pay me. And this year it's going to be a lot worse. But nothing has destroyed the way of life in the UK and Australia and anywhere else it has happened worse than rising house prices. It affects every aspect of life. It has become the biggest thing that we have is being able to afford rent. Or you move miles away to buy a house. In Sydney, you can move miles away and still not afford a house. We have destroyed life for people that are earning a lot more money than their parents, but have virtually nothing to show for it. My dad is now retired. He owns his own home outright. It is probably worth $1 million in New Zealand where he lives. It's beautiful. I now look on that with envy because I could never even afford a 2-bedroom flat that is 1/5 as luxurious as the one my dad lives in. His beautiful 4-bedroom home that he owns outright with no debt. And I have earned more money than my dad my whole life.